never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Dr. James Clark of Douglas, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, can you start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Well, I'm a native of Illinois. I was born in Oak Park, Illinois. I lived all my younger days in Forest Park, Illinois, which is all on the west side of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I was born in 1939, September 27, 1939.
All right. And what did your family do for a living when you were growing up?
My father was in sales. My mother, when I was younger, was, as we say, a housewife. Mm-hmm. But when I was about maybe 4th or 5th grade, she went back to her profession, which was teaching. Mm-hmm. So my mother was a teacher, my father in sales. I did not have any siblings, so I was what modern terms a latchkey kid for a few years.
All right. Yeah. And then when did you finish high school?
1957, Proviso High School in Maywood, Illinois.
Mm-hmm. That's back before there was Proviso East and Proviso West.
Exactly right. The original, yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then did you go on to college from there?
When I was in high school, like a lot of high school students, I was thinking about college out there somewhere. Mm-hmm. So you go to the local library, the college library in the high school, you talk to counselors and start reading the brochures. And I said, yeah, I want to go to school. My mother and dad both went to school. And I started looking around and thought, well, maybe this, maybe that. And I ended up at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio.
Okay. And then what did you study there?
I was in the School of Education, major in what we call now, at that time, secondary education. Mm-hmm. Minor in comprehensive social studies, naval science, and that was it.
All right. The naval science part, were you in an ROTC program?
Naval science was ROTC, okay. Required for any ROTC student.
Okay. But the ROTC, was that your choice, or did all entering students have to put in 2 years of ROTC?
No, I just went in there and signed up. It sounded like a good deal, so I figured, why not? I probably would have been drafted or something after college, so I just went in and signed up, and it was a good move. Just raised my hand at that time, and what was the advantage? If I graduated, I was guaranteed a commission. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, how can you go wrong on that? So that's what I did.
All right. And why did you choose the Navy?
When I chose this college or university, I wanted a school that had an ROTC program. Mm-hmm. And Miami had Air Force and Navy, and I thought, oh boy, they've got Air Force. Well, when I went down there, I'll be quite honest, the Navy program I thought was a better program. And I thought, well, why not? So that's what I did, and it was a good move.
Okay. So what did the ROTC training actually consist of?
Well, we had, of course, the weekly carry the rifle and drill outside, but the classroom work varied. First year was history and orientation, second year weapons and gunnery, third year navigation and engineering, and then the fourth year was under the general heading of leadership, which was, you're prepared to go off to your duty, so a lot of group dynamics and communication skills and so forth, and that was it.
Would you do exercises where you sort of took turns for who was in charge and gave orders?
That's true, or I remember one of our tasks was, what is your first association with your unit or your men? What are you going to say? So that was the introductory speech, and it was a good experience.
And what did they encourage you to say to your men when you first met them?
I think one of the things was don't tell them that, give them the impression that you knew everything, which I didn't, of course. Just tell them who you are, where your background is. Emphasize that you're a unit. You had certain standards, professional, military, and go from there. And I remember the first meeting with my group, and afterwards some of the senior enlisted said, Mr. Clark, You take care of the paperwork, and we'll take care of the men.
Mm-hmm.
So, worked out.
There you go.
Worked out.
They make things work.
They do.
Okay. Now, did you also get sort of some kind of summer exercise or training program?
I was what was known as a contract student. I don't think they don't have that status anymore. I just signed a contract with the Navy. So between my junior and senior year, I had to go on a 6-week, what they call training cruise. I happened to go to San Diego and be on a destroyer. But if you were what is known as a regular ROTC student or one that was on a scholarship, those men, and it was all men at that time, had a summer training every summer. So that was my experience on a ship. And then during the year, we also had opportunities to visit Pensacola, for example, for a week to try to get you interested in naval air. We didn't have any exposure to submarines. Some of the men that were interested in Marine Corps, they had a chance to spend, a week or a weekend at Camp Lejeune. So that was it. That was your hands-on.
Okay. And so what was the San Diego training cruise like?
Well, there were 8 of us, 8 midshipmen, all ROTC students. And what they did is put you in what you'd call junior officer billets under instruction, standing watches on the quarterdeck, standing junior officer of the deck watch, working alongside one of the officers, whatever the specialty would be. I happened to work alongside a communication officer and a personnel officer, but everybody had a different. It was a great experience. What's wardroom etiquette and who really ran things and what were the duties of people.
Okay. So then when did you graduate from college then?
Graduated in June 1961, and that graduation day was commission day.
Okay.
And then a month later, I was aboard a ship.
All right. And then where did you have to report to first?
My first ship was in the USS Purdy DD734, home port Newport, Rhode Island, which I'd asked for. I asked for a small combative out of Newport, Rhode Island. I got exactly what I wanted. But I reported aboard my ship at the Boston Naval Shipyard. It was undergoing, they have so many years, a major overhaul. So this was really a good opportunity because the ship was in dry dock. I could see everything of the ship above and below the water. Saw things being torn up and replaced, which was good because I really got to know the workings of the ship, and I was there for almost 2 months and then up to Newport.
Okay. And how did you spend your time during those 2 months?
There's a lot of work in a shipyard. First of all, it's very dirty work for the shipyard workers and the men on board. But a lot of it was supervising or observing shipyard workers, making sure the specs were being met. As a new officer on board, I had a little booklet I had to fill out, kind of an orientation of asking questions and what kind of equipment is here and there. And then you had a little free time off in Boston, so it worked out. Again, it was just learning what's going on.
All right. And were the other officers or career people, or did they have others who were reserve officers? Or
Well, if I remember correctly, I reported aboard right about the same time with 3 other new ensigns, ensigns. 2 of the men were from the Naval Academy. Another was a regular ROTC, and then I was the contract ROTC, although ensigns are ensigns. The men on board, a few lieutenant junior grades that were going to do their duty, but that was it. And then you had a few lieutenant and above that definitely career. We were, beginning. What are we going to do? So it worked out. They accepted us. Oh boy, somebody we can help with the work.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then when do you set to sea for the first time?
It was in September.
Okay.
And up to Newport through the Cape Cod Canal. And we were in Newport for just a short time. And then when a ship goes in dry dock or in a shipyard, you offload all your ammunition, everything. Well, one of the first tasks we had to do once we're back in Newport is go back down to New Jersey and unload all our ammunition. And that's an all-day process.
Okay. And what kind of armaments did this destroyer
This ship
carry?
had what we called 5-inch 38 guns, 3 twin mounts, some the old 40 millimeter guns, and a puff
Yeah,
puff
aircraft,
type.
yeah.
Yeah. And then of course some torpedoes, depth charges, and that kind of thing. So after unloading ammunition, which is a lot of manual work because you have to lower it through these little scuttles to get them down in the magazines, back to Newport, and then the fun begins. We go down to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for what is known as a refresher training, ref tray, and that is a very difficult thing. But when you're through, after 2 months, the ship is really in top fighting condition. Everybody's really sharp on their duties and so forth. But it's hot and humid and hard work.
All right. Now, does that serve the same function as what gets called a shakedown cruise sometimes, or is this a little more developed?
Yeah, in a way, shakedown is more or less to see if it runs.
Yeah.
After it's been that, the ref tray refresher training is to get the ship into its fighting conditions. Check all the systems, and
Right.
Everybody really gets to know their job. It's a tough thing.
Okay. And did you spend much time in port at Guantanamo, or were you mostly out at sea?
No, when you're in Guantanamo, you're out every day. If you're lucky, if you got a day off where you stayed in, and the trainers would come on board, and there were scripts and scenarios that we'd go through, from tracking submarines to shooting at targets being towed, electronic exercises, maneuvering exercises, exercises aboard the ship, like cryptography exercises, problems in the Combat Information Center. So everybody was constantly on the go. You'd be at general quarters for 8 hours. But that was the idea, to really get you top notch. And at the end of that, I think we were. Back to Newport then.
Okay. All right. And then do you stay long in Newport, or?
We were in Newport about 2 months, and then we took our turn joining the 6th Fleet. In those days, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean was kind of in and out. The 6th Fleet was not always the same ships, and it was our turn, and we met a squadron, more than a squadron, from Norfolk. We rendezvoused with them and then went to the Mediterranean, and we were there from February to August. Which was great for a single guy like me. I mean, we had a lot of nice ports, a lot of work, but also some nice ports to visit.
Yeah, what ports did you see?
Oh, in France, we used to go to France in those days. Cannes, France, Naples, Italy, Genoa, Crete, Istanbul, Volos, Greece, Sardinia. It was great, great. Took me 50 years to get back there, but it was great.
Right. And when you went ashore in these places, what kind of attitude do people have toward American servicemen?
I think it varied on who who are the entrepreneurs. I think the servicemen brought a lot of money to the communities. And communities that normally did not have a lot of ships visiting were very hospitable and very appreciative of the ships visiting. I think there were some areas, like Naples, for example, where the ships may have been more of a problem than the money that it was bringing to the community. It just varied. Istanbul was not too many ships went there, and that was quite hospitable. Volos, Greece was very hospitable to us.
All right. Now, when you put into a port someplace as a junior officer, did you ever have shore patrol responsibility?
Oh yeah, not in Europe, because ensigns weren't on shore patrol at that time. But later on in my career, when I was at JG, yes, I had a couple of shore patrol duties, and of all places, Port of Spain, Trinidad. So that was an experience in itself.
All right, well, we're going to go back there when
Yeah.
we get to that part
Yeah.
of the tour. All right. Now, as you're going around, and this is 62 when you're doing this at
Yes,
this point.
correct.
And it's kind of early part of 62. Was there, I don't know, how much Cold War tension were you feeling, or was this mostly just a pleasure cruise?
In the Mediterranean, I didn't feel any Cold War tension at all. About the only thing I remember, with all the traffic in the Mediterranean, Russian ships, not warships, transports, they never altered courses. So if you're in a formation and there's a Russian transport coming, you knew they were not going to alter their course. They're going to come right through. But other than that, no. And I didn't get the American go home signs and things of that sort. Not at all. That was in, as you said, 62.
Yeah. Now, periodically, there were disturbances in parts of the Middle East, Lebanon, things like that. Were those quiet during the time that you were out there?
I don't recall any.
Yeah.
I don't recall any hot spots at the time
Right.
in the Med.
Okay. And then sort of how when you're on a destroyer like that, you're packed together with a bunch of, a couple hundred guys in a small space. How did you get along with the other officers of the crew?
Well, speak myself, I got along just fine with all of them. I think it's because I think I was fair. I was friendly, but not overly friendly, and I knew a lot about my men, their families, and so forth. So I think I did all right. I did well with the officers. We were all in the same boat. So I said it was easier for guys that were single. The man, officer enlisted with wives and families at home, it was tougher on them because, they didn't have the email and the satellites and the computers and that. Got along with the men, as you said. I think we had 224 men, something like that. Close quarters, you just have to.
All right. And now, did you have kind of an ethnic mix of people in the crew? Were there black sailors at this time?
And so we had black sailors, and at the time we had a number of Filipino men who were primarily in the steward's rating, which was a great opportunity for them, and they were great sailors. They were excellent sailors. Let's see. Filipinos, blacks, a few Hispanics. Not a complete United Nations, but we
Right.
did have a mixture.
Okay. All right. And now, and then, I guess another very, very basic question. When you're going out to sea, did you ever get seasick?
I did, but not there. No, I didn't.
Was that actually later on or earlier?
Later on in my career, and I hate to say it, but when I was sailing in and out of New York Harbor, I don't know what it was. Must have been something I ate.
Yeah, that could be.
No,
All
no.
right.
No,
Not-
that
not-
can be a problem for some of the men. I remember one man I had got sick all the time, and I asked the chief, "What are we going to do about this guy?" And he said, "You just make him stay there with a bucket. That's the only way you're going to get him to get over it." And then he eventually did, but I felt sorry for the guy. You hardly left the dock, and he was sick.
All right. Now, on that first cruise and those Atlantic crossings or in the Mediterranean, did you hit bad weather at any point? Did you have to go through a storm or that kind of thing?
We did not, but on the way returning to the United States, a storm was predicted more in the mid-Atlantic coast. So the admiral allowed the ships that were going back to their home port of Norfolk to leave the formation early to get to Norfolk, but we did not run into any problem going back to Newport.
All right. So when did you get back to Newport then?
It was in August. I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was August.
Okay. And then how long did you stay in port this time?
Unfortunately, not too long. I would remember I was scheduled to go to a school, a communications school, which was in Newport. I was hardly there, and I was called back to the ship because we had to go down the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were called, as a lot of other ships, and we independently steamed from Newport to Guantanamo Bay, independently. And we waited there until we had orders to what we should do, and our orders were to go to San Juan and again stand by, and then we were back in Guantanamo Bay. But we always had gun mounts manned and that. It was not the most comfortable thing.
Okay. And were you able to kind of keep track of the news at that point and find out what was going on?
Our best way, the communication, they would send news bulletins over the, what we call the old teletypes, and that would be our source. TV didn't work out at sea, and no CD radios.
But
or
you couldn't pick up radio stations from the mainland?
Occasionally you could, but then that might tie up one of the receivers that was needed otherwise. So we were down in Puerto Rico. We returned shortly in December. In December, so it was about a 2-month thing. We didn't have. Sometimes, trying to recall, some of the ships were ordered out to track ships. We were never at that stage. We kind of got at the tail end, but we were ready to go. We were on alert, as they say.
Okay. And when you first went down, was there a certain kind of a feeling of tension to it and thinking something might happen, or?
Looking back, I don't think we realized how much tension there was, to be honest. But when you go there and you're sitting in anchored in Guantanamo Bay, anchored, and you're manning your one gun mount, always manned, then you begin to say, oh, this is harder than we think. Yeah.
All right. Now, was this during this cruise that you went down to Trinidad, or would that be on?
Oh, no, that was later on.
Okay.
That was in the spring of '63. Okay. There was some kind of issue about improper shipments of either arms to or from Cuba. I don't remember all the details. And a lot of ships, such as ours, were sent to the area to track certain ships. And the one we were assigned to track, we picked it up in the Caribbean and it went to Port of Spain, Trinidad, and anchored. So what do? We go in and tie up. There used to be a base there, an American military base. So we tied up there and we just monitor that ship, and it didn't move and it didn't move. And then finally, one time, it just lifted, weighed anchor, and off it went. And we followed it so far out into the Atlantic, and then we're told to cease. So it's a question of something with Cuba. I remember that. And that's how we ended up in Trinidad.
Okay. And that's where you got shore patrol.
I had shore patrol in Trinidad, which was interesting, very interesting place because it's such a mixture of cultures. Very interesting. You saw in Trinidad, a lot of extremes, extreme wealth, extreme poverty, but a great mixture of people, friendly, colorful, lots of restaurants, places to do. But shore patrol, sometimes the guys had a little problem on the beach, maybe. So just try to keep the lid on and keep them out of trouble. So that was an experience.
All right. I mean, did they have much trouble, or was it?
I remember a couple of the men were brought back to the ship by local police. When I was on shore patrol with 3 other men, we did not run into any confrontation. Matter of fact, we'd go into, we don't want to check on places. We remember one place, the guy said, "No sailors here, no sailors here." So it worked out. We kept them out of trouble.
Right. Okay. Now, what else? So, what else did you do on that cruise, or was that just keeping track of that one ship
Just
and then
that
go
one
home?
ship, and then we steamed back to Newport. Though there were a number of ships doing that, but it was all independent steaming, independent, which was, usually one or others, one or more, or one in back to when we were in refresher training in Cuba in late '61. Every so often, to give the ships a break, they'd give you a weekend off, and they let you go someplace. And we were scheduled to go to Jamaica. So we're on our way to Jamaica, and I remember I was on watch, and we got a message to return immediately to Guantanamo Bay. And when you take a weekend off like that, you often took men from the base as passengers just to give them a break. And I remember we went back and we pulled back into Guantanamo Bay, and there was this passenger on board, and he said, "My, this looks just like Cuba here." Well, we were called back, and there was something going on in the Dominican Republic, and we patrolled for days, just back and forth in front of Ciudad Trujillo, just back and forth, and then back to refresher training. But no Jamaica. No Jamaica.
All right. Now, was the Trinidad cruise the last one you took, or did you have another one after that?
No, that was it. I had a 2-year active obligation, so I left the ship in July. I left it in. I left it in May. I normally would have left it in June, but they were going on a deployment, and the captain didn't want guys. There were 3 of us that were going to leave within a week, and he said, "No, let's get these men off now." So that was it, and then I figured, now what am I going to do? I have to go get a job.
So, did you go find a job?
I did. My degree was in education, so I was able to locate a junior high school teaching job in Ohio, Oakwood, Ohio. And I did that for a year. It was great, but I thought, nah, I need more than that. So I went back to graduate school at Miami again, and I was in a residence hall position. That was kind of like the scholarship.
Yeah.
And then I completed my master's degree, and I kept looking in my closet, and I see all these uniforms hanging there, and I said, "This is ridiculous, all that work and all these uniforms." So a colleague of mine at the university said, "Come on with me to the reserve unit." So I did, and I got back into the active reserve. That's the
So
drills.
initially, when you left, you went on to inactive reserve briefly.
That's correct.
But then, go into the active reserve. Now, once you then join the active reserves, I mean, what kinds of duties or things
Well,
do you have?
that varied, and again, it changes with the times. There used to be many reserve centers all over. There's just a few now, but the idea was to go in and keep your skills up. And I remember in my career in the reserve, I was known as like a rating group supervisor. That's like a division officer. And then I was a training officer, and I was commanding officer of a number of units, executive officer of a number of units. And again, you went on training, not especially summer, but 2 weeks a year. And again, it was to enhance your skills or keep you up to date. But as in my career in the reserve, I drifted more from ships to more administrative positions, admin, schools, and so forth, which was logical, because I'd go back to the ships, or I'd go back to a port like Norfolk or Newport, and I'd look at the ships, and I couldn't even identify all the equipment anymore. New antennas and new ships, and so it worked out. I mean, I could have gone right back to any kind of command, but I would have been better at a shore command.
Now, the first stage or period when you're doing this is when the Vietnam War is going on.
Correct.
All right. And one of the things that went on at that point was that the government relied to a large extent on the draft, or fear of the draft, to kind of fill the ranks and so forth. And one of the things that went on was that a lot of people tried to get into reserve or guard units in the expectation that they wouldn't have to actually go to Vietnam and so forth. And at times there was competition for that. And from your perspective, working with Naval Reserve units at that time, I mean, how much were you aware of that, or in what ways did that affect who you got and how you did things?
I didn't notice it so much in the Navy at that time. Maybe the Guard would have been different. But in the reserve at that time, if a man, and most of them were men, there were a few women, if a man wanted to join the reserve, then immediately had a so many month active duty period, basic training and so forth. And then they had a number of years required in the active reserve.
Mm-hmm.
But the reserve just couldn't take everybody.
Right.
They had to have a spot for them to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not notice that as a problem as an avoidance. We had a lot of men in the reserve that had served active duty and then were finishing up their obligation.
Okay.
But I didn't notice that as a escape or anything.
Okay. Okay, so what? And while Vietnam was going on, I mean, how much attention did you pay to it, or what the Navy was doing at that time?
I was in a reserve unit in Bloomington, Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
Indiana University.
Yeah.
So during the Vietnam area, when there were a number of student protests on the campus, there was always a fear that students or whoever was going to attack the Armed Forces Reserve Center, and we used to keep guards there 24 hours a day. So that I noticed that.
Mhm.
Okay, I noticed that. We never had pickets or anything like that, but it was a concern. Some of the guys were worried about wearing their uniform on campus, on to and from reserve. That's all I can recall on that. So tough times then. Tough times.
All right. And then you spent a long time in the reserves. You said when did you officially retire out of them?
My official retirement date was in 1991, but my active reserve, let's see, it gets to a point where there are no billets.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a billet or a place to go. And I was a captain in '06, and there were very few billets for captains,
Right.
and a lot of captains. So the Navy, rightfully, those of us that were eligible to retire, they said, we're going to retire you from the active reserve, but you're not officially retired from the Navy.
Right.
Two different steps there. So officially I retired in 1991. It was 30 years. But I was really only active in the reserve and active duty for 23.
Okay. So it's in the 80s when
Yeah,
you go out.
yeah.
Okay. Now, what's the process involved in getting you to captain?
Well, first of all, I think you go through a review board just like any other officer review board. I feel they look at, has the person voluntarily accepted increasing responsibilities? Well, when you volunteered, training officer and executive officer, and you're commanding officer for 3 or 4 units, that shows some promise there. You have your fitness reports by somebody senior to you. That has to be good. You have to keep yourself physically shaved. I mean, not running a mile in 3 minutes, but not overweight. How do your appearance? That's part of it, believe it or not. Of course, you have to pass all the physical exams. Anything that shows professional development and perhaps something extra is all considered. And again, there are only so many promotions in each particular period of time, so it's very very competitive, very competitive.
Okay. And then were there schools you had to attend or training programs to go through to go from one level to the next?
There were no required at that time, no required specific schools, and it varied. My training in the summer varied from seminars at the War College in Newport. I spent one duty evaluating instructors at Women Officers School when it used to be separate. A number of training on ships, working along legal officers, or personnel officers, communication officers. It just varied, but nothing to check off specifically.
Because I guess a lot of officers that I've talked to, at least the ones who were career officers, they pretty much for each stage, it seems, certainly in the Army, they had to go through this school and this school and this school.
That's true, and that's the way it is in the Navy now. I've talked to younger officers, and there's so much. They're much better trained. more. Well, I just think that the training is so much better for the military at the moment.
Okay. And in the course of the time when you're involved with the Navy, both active duty and then active reserves, did you get a lot more women coming in and doing more things, or were they still pretty confined to a small corner?
When I first went into reserve, there was one woman in the unit. She was a personnelist or a yeoman. As it went on, you had a few more women in the ranks, mostly in the personnel ratings. I worked with one female officer in my career in the reserve, but as the years went on, I began to get more. I worked with a woman who was a journalist, J.O. I think now, if you went to a reserve unit, you'd find the representation of women much higher, which it should be. But just one of those, just didn't happen.
Right.
Just didn't happen.
Yeah, because it's coming slowly. I mean, they opened
And
service
also-
academies and so forth.
Yeah, that's correct. That made a big difference. See, when I was in ROTC, they didn't admit women, and I worked for years with the Naval Academy. I was a state coordinator for the Naval Academy Information Officer Program in Indiana. I did it for about 12 years. And the Academy finally, it opened up to women, and that starts sending a signal. As I said earlier, I was evaluating instructors at women officers' school.
Yeah.
And across the road was the officer candidate school where the men were, and there the women, basically doing the same thing but in a different building. So the opportunities are there. And then another factor, I don't think, when I was active in the reserve, that the military was a career that women considered for a number of reasons. They couldn't go anywhere with it. And that's a man's game. But now I've talked to a lot of women, and I've encouraged, just said, you're not sure what you want to do, try the military. Free training, good training, it's a job, good education. So,
All right. And if you think back at your service time, both active duty and reserves, are there other individual incidents or aspects of it that kind of stand out in your memory that you haven't really brought into the story yet?
Well, I remember in ROTC, I didn't like to go out to drill because rain or shine, you were out there in these little woolen shirts, these dark blue shirts we used to have to wear. I remember that. That wasn't too pleasant. Good times, remember a lot of good times. It was hard work, but lots of laughs. I didn't have too many crises to deal with, either militarily or with personnel. I was lucky. It was a good career.
Now, did you wind up talking much to people who served off the coast of Vietnam or were involved in a lot of that stuff over the course of your time in? I mean, officers who come into the reserve or...
To be quite honest, a lot of the men that served in the Vietnam didn't want to have anything more to do with the military. And there were very few that came in the reserve. I remember one young man, but he was going to college. It was at Indiana University. So by being in the reserve, that gave him a little extra cash for his college. But to be quite honest, the guys in Vietnam, they had enough. Just didn't run into that. Not at all.
And the ones in the reserves were, in principle, they could be sent at some point.
Oh, sure. When you're in the reserve, you've raised your hand, and they call you, you go. And I used to get frustrated when I'd read in a paper, I hear on TV, these reservists that were complaining about being called up for active duty. And I said, well, that's why you're in the reserve, because you're trained and ready to go. So, it wasn't just fun and games. It was an obligation. And I told my wife, I said, if I get called, I go. She said, I know. That's why you're in the reserve. Because even though it's a reserve, I could go back and I'd be a lot more prepared for a duty than a newcomer coming in. Maybe not a lot, but somewhat,
But you were not having a whole lot of people out of your units called up to go in at that time,
No,
were you?
I never had any
Yeah.
of my personnel called up. The
Now
only
they-
one I remember being called up, I was at a school in Newport, a communication school, the one that I had to leave early. That instructor got called up. And then the next day, I had to go back to my ship, so I wonder what's going on here. But no, didn't run into
Yeah,
that.
because that was generally the policy not to draw on the Guard and Reserve very much and so forth, which had its own repercussions and
Yeah,
changed
yeah.
things later. But
Yeah.
so in certain ways, you are seeing kind of some of the side effects of Vietnam in
Oh, sure,
different odd
sure,
ways as
sure.
you go through there.
Yeah.
Did you notice any impact of the war and the anti-war movement in terms of sort of the morale or the attitudes of the people that you worked with, or did they stay focused and professional, or?
Oh, I felt that the men and the few women that I worked with in the reserve were very professional. A lot of the men were in the reserve. I happened to spend a lot of time, as I said, in university town. A lot of the men that were in that unit were also going to school. So between the GI Bill, they could also earn a little more in the reserve to help beat the college expenses. So that particular thing. But I've been in reserve units in other communities, and the guys just wanted to serve. They were, true Americans. They raised their hand, and they meant what they said.
Okay. If you look back at your own experience in the service, I mean, how do you think that affected you, or what did you take out of it?
Well, I always say one of the best decisions I ever made was going in the ROTC building and saying, I want to sign up. Be very honest. And I've talked to a friend of mine out in California, did the same thing. We both agree. It was a great opportunity. I've had a positive experience in the military, and I'd recommend it for anyone, male or female, especially those people that are not sure where they're going in life. I learned in the military, you learn responsibility for other persons. Professionally, sometimes personally, military skills. You learn that. You learn how to work with groups. I found the opportunities to be in various parts of the world or the other parts of the United States to be a great thing. But I liked it. I liked the discipline, which was not. Never found it to be harsh, even though when I was a midshipman, just kind of go with the flow. But this was positive for me. Met a lot of great people.
And then you want it largely in a career in administration for schools, or?
Well, I was in when I went back for graduate school, and then I worked as assistant dean of man at Miami University.
Okay.
And again, you look, so I'm not going to go anywhere in this profession unless I get a doctorate. So then I went over to Indiana University, earned a doctorate in education, and then I went back to school as a dean at Hanover College in Indiana. And then I found, I'm getting kind of old in this business here, the 24 hours with these lively students, so I switched to, I left that career and went over and worked for the federal government and did 25 years in there. And last job I had with the government was I was an investigator for the Department of Defense and discrimination complaints, harassment complaints. So I ended up kind of dual career, many years in college student personnel, and then finished in the federal government.
All right. And do you find then that the Navy experience or whatever, or those things that helped you with these other jobs?
Oh, yeah, especially working for the federal government. That Navy ID card opened a lot of doors, and also I could kind of tell people, I say, look, I've been through this. This military stuff, you can't pull the wool over my eyes. I know how it works here. So yes, that was very, very helpful wherever I went. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, civilian post. It was a great help. You knew the structure. You knew how things worked. It was not always the person on top as the one you wanted to talk to. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, it makes for a good story. So
Well,
thank you very
great.
much for coming in and sharing it today.
My pleasure. Enjoy talking with you.
never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.